What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for the Lamplighters League, a 1930s alternative history occult tRPG from Harebrained Schemes, the people behind Shadowrun and Battletech. But before we dive too much into that, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that includes the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're curious about everything that I cover, there is a link in the description below covering it, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Also important to mention that I did get a review copy of this game, however I only got it about a day before the game actually released, so it took a little extra time to get this out. And to be upfront with you guys, at the beginning of this video, the Lamplighters League is a bit of a mixed bag for me. There are some things I think it does very well that are interesting and engaging, and there are other parts this game really falls flat, which naturally we're going to discuss over the course of this video. But to give a brief overview, as I mentioned, the game is an occult sort of alternative history 1930s setting, where we take on the role of a bunch of scoundrels and thieves, as the game likes to put it, often referring to them as the best of the worst, after a more formal organization called the Lamplighters failed to stop the Banished Court, and now it's up to us. The Banished Court is made up of 3 houses, each with their own occult methodology, trying to take over the world and reshape it in their image. We need to stop them by participating in turn-based tactical combat alongside a real-time infiltration mode, set against the backdrop of a more common tRPG approach where there is a sort of doomsday clock ticking in the background as the court tries to achieve their goals. Moving on though, I like to start these reviews talking about the technical state of said game, especially when it is a new release. And while the Lamplighters League isn't really riddled with game-breaking problems, it does still have a fair few. The performance is a bit underwhelming. I often got FPS drops, stuttering, some weirdly long load times here and there, but there are 2 issues that kind of stand out above the rest. For starters, I did deal with a lot of crashes. In the time I played this game, it crashed on me probably 5 or 6 times, with no real common thread between them. And then on top of that, there is a recon mode in the game that allows you to sort of inspect enemies, and for whatever reason, whenever this was active, it just tanks your FPS. And despite using a 4090, enabling recon mode tanked the FPS down to like 20 every time. So I don't really know what that was about. So while there was nothing game-breaking, it doesn't run the best. From there, let's talk story and setup. So the story of this game is essentially what I've already told you. There are 3 occult houses that make up the Banished Court trying to take over the world. We would like to stop them with our ragtag team of misfits, and we jump into doing just that. In order to stop these houses, we have to achieve a variety of goals, such as robbing each of them in a big heist mission that is required, alongside gathering a few other items. And this is all necessary to enter what is called the Tower, or the Tower of Babel, basically, that the occult houses need to get into as well to take over the world. And that's the bulk of the story. It never really evolves beyond that. There's no like big twists coming at you, which for a tRPG is fine. It's pretty much what you see is what you get. And the ending is pretty much what you would expect. So while I doubt the game's story is going to blow anybody away, I do think it is serviceable for the game and the genre. I did want to mention the doomsday clock though. If you just happen to be curious, when the doomsday clock fills up, you do have one more chance to prevent them from entering the tower. That is to say, that particular house, via a mission before you outright lose. Outside of our main goals, a lot of the story is told through the conversations between all of our agents in between missions. And this is interesting because with the way the game unlocks more and more agents, you might not even see some of them, or you might get them incredibly late in the game. And because of that, playing through the game with different agents is about the closest thing you'll get to any replayability. From there though, let's talk difficulty. There are 3 difficulties, and you do have to choose it right at the start of the campaign. You can't change this later, and it is basically easy, normal, hard, or explorer, adventurer, and survivor. The main difference between these is how rapidly the enemy is progressing. Basically, as their doomsday clock fills up, they'll reach certain milestones that then give them stronger enemies and units, and this happens much faster on survivor difficulty, and much slower, of course, on easy. Now, as a sort of consequence to this, When you're on normal mode or easy mode, if you're playing well, especially on normal mode, you'll have time to do everything, and almost certainly on easy. That is to say, you'll be able to recruit all the agents, take on optional missions, etc. Whereas on Survivor, you're a little more pressed for time, which means you might only want to be recruiting agents you actually need and want, on top of actively tackling the biggest threat reduction from the banished courts. So because of that, I think Survivor is still best served for a second playthrough where you kind of know how everything works already, but I wouldn't say it's overwhelming in terms of its difficulty if you are familiar with the genre. Otherwise, I found normal to be a pretty relaxed experience, with plenty of room for error and learning on the fly. Next up, I want to talk about how this game is structured a little bit, just so I can inform some of the rest of the things we're going to talk about. Essentially, the game takes place in weeks. Every week, you can do one mission where you actually send agents to go take care of it and you control them in person. You can also complete any number of search missions that are available. This is where you send a particular agent out for supplies or to search for new recruits, etc. What you're able to do in a given week is generated on the world map here, which shows our doomsday clock progression as well as where the enemy leaders are and what they're contributing to an area, alongside any more optional missions like the search missions. Now, the doomsday clock progresses in tick marks, basically. Every mission generated by the world map is associated with a certain threat level. The higher the threat, the more it increases the doomsday clock for each individual faction. And you can reduce the threat by taking on high threat missions. They are usually a little bit harder and more dangerous, but they reduce the incoming threat, thus the progress meter for that faction. However, we can't do everything. As I mentioned, we can only manually control our agents on a mission once per week, which means you have to pick and choose. And because there are 3 houses, someone's going to be successful. And by itself, that's not that big of a deal. However, when you start factoring in the recruitment missions and things like that, it's where it gets a little tricky, because in order to recruit new agents, we have to go on a mission to do that, which means we're not countering any real threat gains for the banished court that week. This is why recruiting all of the optional agents on Survivor is so difficult. Another thing to keep in mind is that in addition to just increasing enemies as the doomsday clock goes up, you also have to watch out for the breakpoints on the clocks themselves. These are those larger marks on the individual clocks, and when the enemy reaches those, you'll get a cutscene for that faction showing their increase in power, and it also unlocks a major upgrade to whatever their enemy faction is. In some cases, it outright replaces certain enemies with stronger variants or grants them a new ability, things like that. Those breakpoints are the biggest things to keep the enemy from reaching. So managing this and then going on the missions and dealing with that gameplay side of things makes up the bulk of the game. But before we dive into the gameplay and the combat, let's talk a bit about the progression systems at play. First and foremost, we have the progression of getting more and more agents. You'll start the game with 3 of them and then go on to recruit more in the first few weeks of gameplay. And the first few weeks of the game are not timed. You're not up against the doomsday clocks, and you'll recruit 1 or 2 people here as well to get you started. But after that, unlocking and gaining more agents is a big part of progression, because getting more agents unlocks their abilities and unique approaches to combat, along with extra bodies to perform the search missions. The main upgrade path for these agents, though, is skill points. Every time you complete a mission, you will earn skill points that are shared amongst all of your agents that you can then spend on upgrading and unlocking their abilities, which makes them more effective combatants. It is important to note, however, that you will not get enough skill points to fully upgrade all 10 characters. So while it's definitely okay and the right thing to do to focus on the agents you're going to be using the most, you do still want to pick and choose what is actually going to be the most impactful. Another big form of progression is simply the equipment for each character. Characters have a number of pockets that they can use to store consumables and things like that to use in combat, but we also have equipment like armor and weapon mods that will affect how that character performs and the amount of armor available to them. And while not as drastic as some of the skill upgrades, these are still an important part of progression, especially the weapon mods. One of the key ways equipment is unlocked is by recruiting allies. In addition to your agents, you can also recruit 3 allies: a healer, a weaponsmith, and a medium of sorts who deals with another mechanic we'll get to in a second. But all 3 of these allies have a skill tree associated with them that you can spend a resource on to unlock passive benefits for your characters, alongside more direct unlocks such as equipment or populating the supplier with new tiers of equipment as well. And this is how we'll unlock our extra consumable slots and healing in between combat. Last but not least, and I would say probably the one true unique progression system this game has, is the undrawn hand. Basically, This is a deck of cards that you get right at the start of the game, and when you successfully complete a mission, the agents that went on that mission draw a card from the deck of cards. This can provide them a variety of benefits. At first, you'll only be able to equip one card per character, but if you unlock more through your allies, the medium one in particular, you can have up to 3. These cards offer substantial benefits to what that character can do. However, the cards you draw is a bit random, and while upgrading your abilities with that particular ally that affects this, you have better chances at better stuff. The way this mechanic works makes it basically impossible to do much planning for. However, if you get repeats of the same card, you can stack them on top of each other to increase their effect up to a maximum of level 5. 3 is a base though. Some of these cards offer just extra abilities, some of them provide powerful passive benefits, so they're pretty varied in what they do, and they can drastically alter the way an individual agent plays if you get lucky enough to draw something useful. But it does, in any event, provide a certain element of surprise to the gameplay in between missions. But now that we've covered all of that, let's talk about the gameplay and combat here. This kind of goes hand in hand when you're actually in a mission, so we're going to talk a little bit about both at the same time, starting with infiltration. Outside of the turn-based combat, we are in real-time infiltration mode. We're going to use this to explore the level and potentially take enemies out silently and set up the battlefield for any potential combat encounters. Now, first thing I want to say here is don't try to fight everything. In fact, some missions can be completed without even entering combat at all. Not every mission, depending on what the actual objective is, such as, killing a particular target who might be immune to takedowns, for instance. But outside of stuff like that, where you're just supposed to steal something or recover something, in many of those instances, if you are patient enough, you can do that without alerting the enemies, which mostly comes down to takedowns and stealth. Every agent we get, despite their unique combat abilities, is separated into one of 3 types: your sneaks, your saboteurs, and your bruisers. Each of them has an environmental action, such as sneaks being able to climb certain things, bruisers being able to break down certain walls, and saboteurs being able to pick certain locks. Each of them also has a unique takedown ability. Sneaks, for instance, don't get detected from behind an enemy. That is to say, the normal circular detection range on an enemy is halved for a sneak, which allows them to get up and take targets out in melee via their takedown ability Sucker Punch. And their overall reduced noise range when they are by themselves and ungrouped from the party makes them ideal for sneaking into tight spots to take out someone in particular. Saboteurs have shock mines. These both distract and lure in targets who are then taken out by the shock. You can also use this on wet surfaces to spread that shock though, which is where it becomes potentially useful depending on the environment. Now, I would say the best one realistically is the bruiser, because the bruiser can take out multiple enemies at once with their slam ability. They can charge forward, and up to 3 targets in that path will be taken out at once. So if used effectively, the bruiser is the best at taking people out, but in all of those cases, you do have to know that some enemies, especially a lot of the occult monsters, are immune to takedowns in this manner, which is where the recon mode comes in. This is effectively a free camera that allows you to move around, scout the level out, and if you can see an enemy based on the sight range, hover over them, see what their abilities and passives are so you can decide how to approach it. Now, as I'm sure you've seen and I've basically said already, enemies have a sort of sight cone or detection range. And because of this, when you know that you don't have to fight all the enemies all the time, which the tutorial makes clear, it is possible to just sneak your way around encounters entirely. That's a very valid way to approach things. So I would advise people, especially newcomers to the genre, to know that sometimes what you should be trying to do isn't necessarily how can I take out as many people as possible, but rather how can I just walk around them? Which is especially important when you take into account the fact that our number of takedowns per mission is limited, usually between 2 and 3. However, you can replenish an individual character's takedowns and signature abilities by finding a second wind consumable, so to speak, which is just something in the environment you can interact with that refreshes their takedown limit. Inevitably, at some point, you're going to have to actually fight enemies, so let's talk about the proper turn-based combat system. On the surface level of things, this is a very run-of-the-mill tRPG 2 action point combat system. You have 2 action points, you can use them to move or use your abilities, all of which which typically use one action point. You can attack twice, you can move double the distance, etc. So you can spend those however you want. Some characters have abilities that will grant them more and more action points, and each character has their own unique abilities and feel, but the broad system at play, that 2 action point system, is very standard for the genre. What makes it interesting, of course, is the fact that each of our agents has a unique play style and strengths and weaknesses. For instance, Eddie, my favorite character personally, has 2 pistols that allow him to shoot at multiple targets every time he attacks. He gets abilities that will do a big guaranteed crit that can then possibly refund action points that then let him shoot it up to potentially 6 targets in a round while also recovering all of his ammo at the same time, just to give one example. Another one, Ingrid, uses her fist. However, every time she takes out a target, she refunds an action point, which means softening enemies up with other characters only to use Ingrid to then wipe the floor with all of them. Recovering action points the whole while can set you up for some pretty big combos. So, as you might expect, the abilities and shortfalls of these characters do complement each other, and playing around with those combinations is where you're going to get a lot out of combat. And overall, that can feel pretty satisfying. So despite the combat system itself being pretty run-of-the-mill, it is nonetheless a very competent version of it, which is further enhanced by signature abilities and agent passives. In order to make each agent feel unique, they have passive abilities unique to themselves. For instance, Ingrid's ability to recover action points when she kills someone. But each character also has a unique signature ability. This is their big ultimate move that you can only use so many times per mission. 1 initially, and then with skill point upgrades it can be made into 2. Finding a second wind consumable will also restore your signature abilities, and these are very powerful. For instance, Ingrid is a big AoE knockdown for everyone around her. Eddie's is a big sweeping cone attack. Fadir is a pick up and throw option that also knocks everyone down, which effectively robs them of their next turn. And again, playing around with those combos is a lot of fun. But given that you're going to be often very outnumbered if you don't successfully manage the infiltration phase, it's important to understand how to take turns away from the enemy, which comes from doing things like knocking them down or reducing their action points via things like dazed. Because if you're not careful, the enemy is very capable and will do those things to you as well. But we're not done yet, because there's 3 more mechanics I need to talk about here. Each character, both you and the enemy, has a stress meter. These are the red notches above your character's health bar, and when these max out, you are hit with a stress break. This causes that character to lose an action point on their next turn, and when the mission is over, they are dealt a breaking card from the undrawn hand, which can have all sorts of negative effects, usually on the next mission or so. So naturally, we don't want stress breaks, but what we do want is to apply them to the enemy. Stress builds up basically whenever your character gets hit or some effect that causes even more, but generally participating in combat will naturally increase their stress level. On the enemy side of things, this can be done by, of course, attacking them, but also if you kill leaders, this will usually demoralize and stress out the enemies around that leader, which can lead the enemy to a stress break. But unlike our agents, enemies can be immediately dispatched for free if they hit a stress break. When they have one active, we get an extra ability that costs 0 action points as long as you are in range of that enemy, where you can go instant kill them, which means playing a build with a character that intentionally stresses people out, which is possible thanks to things like undrawn hand cards, alongside a couple of abilities and consumables. It's a very valid approach to simply max out stress on characters and instantly kill them as a result. And that's a system I like quite a bit. The other 2 are pretty much purely negative. Essentially, if you don't do well in combat and your characters get hit and go down and potentially even die, we have other things to talk about. For starters, wounds and the lost condition. When a character reaches 0 hit points in combat, they don't immediately die. They go into a mortal danger state, at which point you have an opportunity to save them. When this happens after the mission is over, provided you are able to save them, they will usually be hit with a wound, which then has to be healed, provided of course you have the ally that enables you to do that. This uses a resource that allows you to heal them instantly if you have it. Otherwise, you might have to take them on a mission already wounded, but that is also fine. You can do that. It just comes with its own negative effects. But truth be told, wounds were a bit of a non-factor. I almost always had enough resources to heal them instantly. So unless you're just doing really, really poorly, this isn't likely to come up very often. Last but not least, we have the lost status. Basically, if a character goes into mortal danger and you don't save them, they become lost, which of course means they are unavailable for missions and everything. However, you might have the chance to save them a couple weeks afterwards, though this will require you to actually undertake the mission to go save them, which means you're not actively dealing with the Banished Court's threat that week, so it's a bit of a trade-off. Now, with everything I just mentioned and talked about, you might have been wondering to yourself if you could sort of save scum your way through this, and technically yes, but not easily by any means. For starters, each campaign that you have going has a limited number of manual save slots, and it will auto-save every time you enter a mission or when you enter a new week, that is to say the in-between mission phase. You can manually save during a mission, however, saving takes a weirdly long time, which can be pretty frustrating. So with a lack of quick save or anything like that, technically yes, you can save scum your way through individual missions trying to get the best outcome, making sure you don't lose characters, etc. But doing so is very much so a hassle, so something to keep in mind. From there, let's finally talk about the Steam Deck compatibility. The Steam Deck for this particular game is a great way to play it. It is verified on Steam, it has cloud saves, and controller support, which is naturally what we want, and happy to report that it runs pretty well over there. A couple of the loading times are really long, and it has the usual issues that I encountered on PC, such as the weird FPS drop in recon mode, etc. But otherwise, the game is very playable on the Steam Deck. The controller support and mission format all works together very well, which is usually the case for tRPGs. For those who aren't aware, this particular genre of game does really well on the Steam Deck across the board. If anything, it's more rare when the game performs badly here, which I have seen once or twice, but this genre of games is almost universally great for the Steam Deck, just as a format, so as is usually the case, it is also quite good here. So if you wanted to play the game in a more portable fashion, it is very doable. Now from there, however, let's talk positives, negatives, and then wrap this thing up. So, on the positive side of things, for me, I really enjoyed the setting with the Banished Court, the occult elements, the alternative 1930s history, all of that stuff really landed for me. I enjoyed that a lot. I even enjoyed the art style, which is obviously more subjective, but still, I thought it was great. I also really enjoyed how the game transitions from infiltration into combat. For those who may not know, other tRPGs have tried things like this, but it often turns into feeling more like a puzzle than anything else. And the Lamplighters League, on the other hand, thanks to its takedown abilities and everything, and the fact that you can bring different agents with you, etc., makes it feel like you are genuinely choosing how to approach this combat situation, or to potentially even avoid it entirely. So I think the Lamplighters League successfully does something I've seen other tRPGs struggle to do. And I think that is really where this game shines. But let's talk negatives. Obviously, we have the performance issues. This game plays a bit rough for as simple as it is. As I mentioned, the game crashed on me quite a bit, FPS drops, etc. Nothing game-breaking, but enough to be very annoying. I also think the way you go about recruiting agents could use some work, because as it stands, you might not be getting some of those agents until very late in the game, at which point your skill points are pretty much spent already, so catching that agent up is actually really difficult, even if you do recruit them. So on top of already being pressed for time to recruit them when they become available, if you choose to do so, they're also likely to be behind the progression curve of everyone else anyway, which means you're very unlikely to use them in most cases, which doesn't feel great, especially since recruiting agents is where you're going to get more dialogue and things about the characters that expand on the setting, which could be a point of frustration. Even more so tied to the fact that the base game has 10 agents we can use in combat, but there's actually 11, because the game has one of them locked behind a deluxe version of the game from day one, which I am very strongly against. And then lastly, for negatives, in my opinion, this game plays it a little too safe with its mechanics, because as I mentioned in the positive section, it does have unique setting and unique art and stuff, and then I think it does the infiltration into combat really well. However, this game isn't doing anything that other tRPGs don't already do. In fact, I would go so far as to say the only real unique mechanic is the undrawn hand, really, and everything else I've seen somewhere else before. And while they might have spun it together in a bit of a novel way, if you play a lot of these games, this game can very much so feel like a light version of many other titles I've already played. And all of that draws me to my final conclusion here. The Lamplighters League is selling for $50 US on Steam, and of course whatever that amounts to regionally for people, but it is also available through Xbox Game Pass. And overall, I would say that the Lamplighters League is a fun tRPG that has a lot of character in terms of its setting and art, and a fun approach to very standard systems for the genre. But it's also got a fair few issues that get in the way of that experience. We've got the rough performance, we've got the character behind a paywall, alongside a few other issues that I've outlined mind that ultimately make it good but not great. And given that most games in this genre tend to fall between $30 and $40, on top of things like performance issues, etc., makes this a pretty firm buy on sale for me. I wouldn't want to pay $50 for this. Now, luckily for everyone basically, this game is available on Xbox Game Pass, which alleviates many of the issues and makes it more accessible, given the relatively low risk of trying it out there. But whether it is simply cheaper in the future or you're trying it out on Xbox Game Pass, I do think this is a particularly good place to start for beginners to learn about this particular genre of games. But until then, I just don't think it quite justifies its asking price. That though is going to do it for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, found it informative. If you enjoyed it or you just want to hear about more games like this, tRPGs, cRPGs, etc., or just kind of RPGs in general at this point, do subscribe and stick around. I review them all the time. And don't forget to like and comment while you're at it. Regardless of any of that though, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.